Hi, everyone. We'll just wait another few seconds to see if we get everyone joined. We'll get kicked off in a minute or so. Okay, I see the numbers climbing, so we'll give it another few seconds, and then I think, Nicole, we've got lots to get through, so we'll get kicked off. Just wait another couple seconds. And for anyone who joined us slightly later, I think we've got the recording that they can watch afterwards anyway.
Sounds good.
All right, well, I've got 4:02. Nicole, I think you've got 11:02, so we'll get kicked off. I see the numbers still going up, so I'll maybe try and drag out my intro a little bit so we don't miss anything of importance. But for everyone who's here, hello, welcome to the webinar. I think we have people joining from lots of different time zones, so wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for some. Thanks for joining. Theme for today, really looking at the equation that TA leaders are consistently being asked to balance. How do we reduce costs while at the same time continue to evolve to optimize how we deliver recruiting in your organization? I think especially in the context of ever more challenging skills and market conditions. So hopefully for those who've joined, that's exactly why you're all here. And if not, well, you're kind of already here, so may as well stay to hopefully hear something interesting as we go along. One piece of housekeeping before I forget, we do have some folks who have submitted questions before the webinar, so we'll definitely try and make as much time as possible to get to those. But for anyone who hasn't submitted questions into the webinar yet, but we've got questions as we go through or has something specific they want to try and get some time for, drop those into the chat section on the panel that you see in front of you. And I think, Nicole, we're both keen to try and leave as much time as we can for some Q&A at the end of today. So do make the most of that, and we'll definitely try and get to as many of those as we can. So maybe just to get us started, actually, we'll start with some personal introductions. Hopefully, some of you already know myself and Nicole, but for anyone who doesn't, so I'm Stu Brown, Head of Consulting at AMS, based in the UK, sit within our strategy consulting practice. Been with AMS for 10 years, and within that time, actually been really fortunate to have had a number of different roles in that time. So spent a few years designing and building AMS's sourcing and insights approach. I've led large-scale global recruitment teams. So I've sat in the same seat as many of you on the call today, tried to solve for many of the same things, probably learned some hard lessons along the way, and have some more war wounds to share as a result. Been in the consulting world then for 4 years now in this strategy consulting team, and actually really loved being able to take some of what I've learned from a operational delivery perspective, what I've learned elsewhere, and applying that to different organizations, different geographies, different sectors, etc. And actually probably spend most of my time answering the exact questions that we're looking at today. So how to drive down cost but maintain value and quality. And as we'll go through, Nicole, I guess one of the key things for me certainly is the idea that some of the what is fairly straightforward, but the stuff that keeps our roles interesting is trying to solve for some of the how, right? Where how you solve this for different organizations, locations, etc. that's probably what keeps the job interesting. So really pleased to be here. Hopefully I have something useful to share. But in the meantime, Nicole, I'll pass over to you.
I was muted. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Brender-Brandis. I am the head of strategy consulting for the Americas region, so Stu's counterpart in the Americas. I have spent the better part of about 7.5 years between AMS and the Big Four as a leader in human capital and talent acquisition consulting. Prior to that, I spent about 25 years in industry, one of the few people who actually went into HR on purpose. So I have spent a good deal of my time as a recruiter and as a leader, building and growing talent acquisition teams in pretty much all regions and across many different industries as well. And you can tell from Stu's accent, he's not in the United States. I am in Florida, is where I call home. So it's a pleasure to have everybody here today. And we'll jump in, Stu.
Yeah, I'm always constantly reminded that Florida is much more glamorous than Belfast. So now everyone else knows that as well, which is terrific. But yeah, so to maybe get us kicked off, I guess what we thought would be useful is maybe to set some context, give us some wider context for where this discussion comes from, and some of the things that Nicole and I spend our time with is this idea of the priority triangle. So the priority triangle, and there are multiple different versions of this, so you may have seen it in a slightly different guise elsewhere. But in essence, really, the priority triangle is looking at the relationship and the balance between speed of delivery, cost of service, and quality of outcome or quality of experience. And really importantly, critically, actually, all of those three components in the context of some of the more holistic or strategic mandates that you're trying to solve for. So DEI maybe being a really obvious prominent one for most organizations. And the reason we think this is important as context, when Nicole and I got together thinking about what do we want to cover on here, what are some of the things that we often hear when we speak to organizations, is actually historically TA leaders or business leaders of any stripe have had to choose kind of 2 out of the 3 elements that you see on screen and almost sacrifice something or accept a deficit in the 3rd element. So for example, a TA leader might need to choose or want to choose speed of delivery, so a low time to offer, and want to do that with a low cost per hire. And historically, they've kind of had to be willing to accept the idea that, well, that probably means the quality of experience that is delivered or the quality of outcome that is delivered is not as good as it could otherwise have been. And for lots of organizations, lots of the organizations that we have on the call today, kind of large, global, complex type orgs, TA leaders typically have opted for almost different prioritization models in different parts of the organization for different hiring types. So for example, many of the organizations that we work with for high volume class hiring, customer service, manufacturing type roles, the primary focus is typically low cost and speed of delivery. And quite often when Nicole and I and the teams work with these leaders, we've seen that candidate experience is actually much weaker, which tends to lead to worse hiring outcomes, inefficient funnel conversions, higher dropout rates, and need to overhire against your demand, etc. All of which are self-defeating for a TA organization, right? It leads to rework, additional costs you didn't expect, etc. While in other areas of the same organization, thinking maybe of technology as a prominent example, many organizations have built strategies on making sure the right quality of talent comes through at the speed demanded by the business, which is incredibly difficult because the market's very tough. But that also tends to come with a much higher cost per hire as a result. So tech hiring is seen as I guess, a more expensive pursuit. So to solve for tech hiring, for example, some organizations have invested in headcount, sourcing headcount, to account for longer search and engagement time. It just takes longer to find the people, engage the people that you're looking for. And that typically comes at a higher cost and actually headcount, so it's kind of usually a higher fixed cost. The result is that it's more expensive to run that way, but you maintain your quality. For others who don't then invest in improved search and engagement capability, the results may be a lower cost or a maintained cost, but slower delivery or maybe worse, no delivery, and then a reliance on agencies, etc. If you think about agency and technology as that one example, we see across most organizations, agency reliance maybe 12–15% of your total hiring footprint, whereas across the rest of your organization, it's maybe closer to 7–9%, something in that kind of ballpark would be pretty normal. So most organizations are struggling with that specific challenge. But I think the more interesting thing for today, and hopefully what Nicole and I can walk through a little bit, or at least introduce the idea of, is what if that was no longer the case? What if those relationships between cost, speed, quality maybe weren't quite as rigid as historically they have been? And actually, having worked with dozens of organizations over the last couple of years, consulting, solving for these challenges together with them, I'd suggest that may no longer be the case. Certainly some of the work that we've delivered would suggest there are different ways to solve for this. There is, I think, a pathway to having all three, or at least having a greater piece of all three. So maybe to use the previous example about tech hiring, for example, I've worked with loads of organizations in the UK, EMEA, North America to look at sourcing solutions, for example, that do not rely on additional headcount as the immediate or the only response to increase in search capacity. We've worked with organizations, for example, on leveraging AI-powered search tools, stack and rank technology, machine learning technology, all designed to automate much of the heavy lifting around the candidate search. And what we've seen is that actually that can reduce the burden, the time burden on a sourcer, maybe as much as 30–40%. But really importantly, and I think, Nicole, this is something you and I spend a lot of time thinking about, is how to then repurpose that efficiency into allowing sourcers or recruiters to get on the phone, get into the market, engage quality candidates, and essentially tell stories. So how, using the automation efficiency to drive the additional value and free up the capacity to allow that to happen. So today's all about this idea of how do we find that balance between cost pressures, looking for in-year savings, looking for midterm lower operating costs. How do you balance that against a market that's asking for an ever more sophisticated, intelligent, targeted method of recruiting? That's quite a difficult balance to find. So that's hopefully what we'll get into today, and be able to share some of the ideas, things that have worked, that we've seen at other organizations. So Nicole, if that's the exam question, maybe we start with the 5 or 6 things that when we go into these organizations, the things that we kind of go after, the what, and like I said at the start of the call, maybe we can bring to life a little bit the why that sits, or sorry, the how that sits behind it, how we've actually solved for some of that stuff, because I think that's probably the more interesting conversation. The what, I'm hoping, is pretty intuitive at this point.
Forward, yeah. So, and I think we'll start with the top one, and it's really about this concept of how we structure where we have people, the locations that we're looking at, because in many organizations, that cost of the human resource of delivering talent acquisition can be upward of 50% of the total TA operating costs. So it stands to reason that that's one of the first places that organizations try to look at, how can I at least control that, but still bring tremendous value to my organization. And often what we find working with clients is that there is a bit of a hidden cost in how work gets organized. So quite often we'll see that you have highly compensated recruiters who are spending significant time on administrative type activities. And the other is where those people sit. So quite often it's in very high cost locations. So not only is the resource at a higher level, but the place they are. So right, often it's both administrative tasks being performed by a highly paid recruiter who may often sit in a high cost location. And the impact to that to an organization can be, 35% or more increase in your transaction cost. So there are a few things that I think organizations can think about doing, and where AMS has really leaned in with our clients to focus on. And the first is what I would consider a fairly simple time map activity, and really get in and figure out where things are sitting. because you don't need to likely get to, what I call a scientific level of specificity, but with some real practical looks at where people actually spend their time, not how it's defined in the job description of where they should be. You're very likely to find some opportunities to get it in the right place. And again, this is more about maybe controlling the cost and really shifting to what Stu said about the recruiter focused on really valuable activities, which does increase then your overall outcomes. I think the second thing as we think about structure is, we have this onshore, offshore, now near shore, and that's all about your location strategy of where your staff should sit. And depending on your organization side, if you already have established facilities where the infrastructure is in place in either off or near shore locations, you're likely to have a fairly high chance of success in transitioning potentially some of that TA work within there. If you don't already have that, it becomes very difficult. And that's where we've been able to work with clients. So I'll use when we have a pharma client that we work with, where they actually did have infrastructure in a low-cost facility in Manila. We were able to leverage that, and they delivered quite a bit of sourcing there, and they held that internally. As we were optimizing some of their structure with regards to the RPO, we actually identified some nearshore opportunities where they didn't have the infrastructure, and AMS is able to help bring that and to help solve that equation of how do you get the resources where they might be. And it talks then a little bit about that concept of insourced or outsourced. And I think quite often people think of that as an either or. It's an all-in commitment. But for us, there's really great power in thinking about a hybrid type of solution as well. So if you think along that segmented specialization of work, so it might be things like the sourcing team, and there's value. Maybe you can't scale to that, or you don't have the headcount or the skill that you need to deliver. It could be you look at key talent segments. Maybe it's sales, maybe it's technology, or could be the coordination type efforts. And as organizations look at the balance sheet, both related to cost and distribution of risk, making decisions around outsource, insource, some kind of a hybrid model, we have found to be a place where people can, again, keep their teams focused on real high value activities while actually finding the savings behind the scenes.
I think what's interesting about that is that that's probably some of the most interesting conversations I think we have had recently. Certainly if I think about some of the major organizations that I've worked with project-wise over the last maybe 12, 18 months, just the drivers that sits behind some of those decisions, I think is the important one, right? So I've worked with organizations where it's a full outsource model, everything is included, AMS deliver all services, kind of core delivery, peripheral delivery, all of that good stuff. But we've also then spoke to organizations where, to your point, it's scalability at point of need, or it's looking for very specialist skills, maybe around sourcing, as you mentioned. And I guess maybe a prominent example, large technology firm, UK based. We're really having some challenges around being able to scale upwards and downwards for their developer demand, right? That there's always a need for developers across multiple different requisition types, being able to kind of engage that talent constantly, almost above requisition level. They were finding really tricky. It's a hyper kind of specialized sourcing request. And so they worked with AMS on a sourcing only outsourcing agreement, I guess, where AMS sourcers came in, worked above market to find developer talent, be in the market consistently around developer talent, and then essentially populate future pipelines, talent pools alongside that client organization to drive some of the benefits around time to shortlist in particular, but also driving down agency costs. And I think really importantly, where I've seen that type of model work really quite well is around things like diversity, for example. So also another major banking client, AMS supporting a similar kind of arrangement around sourcing only in that instance, but it was specifically for female developer talent. And again, that worked really well as you said, Nicola, like that, the kind of specialized segmentation, that works really well in that instance. But it depends on your core driver and your point as well around infrastructure, what you already have in place today and where that needs to be augmented potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we look at the other two, because as you think about that tie about people, and it automatically hits into what I would think of as, really process and technology, or here we're talking about workflow optimization, innovation within the sector. And I think it's become almost impossible to not talk about tech and process hand in hand. But within process, I think one of the easiest things that organizations can do, it sounds really obvious, but is thinking about like, what are the bottlenecks? What are the places where you have too many handoffs? Where has work become overly complicated? But sometimes knowing where they are and being able to step back and understand how did we get there in the first place is almost as important. So I was working with a financial services client, and AMS was supporting them with a process redesign in advance of a new applicant tracking system. And one of the things as we were evaluating their end-to-end process, we saw that was a lot of people who worked there had 15, 20 years with the organization, and they said, oh, I know why it's that way. Once, 20 years ago, a person made a mistake, and we've done, their words were, we've bubble wrapped ourselves so that nobody can ever make mistakes again. But what they've done is created this really complex, really long process in an effort to present an error that might have only happened once, probably could have been resolved with some upskilling or training, but really being able to understand how did you even get there, and then how do you back out of that to simplify your processes. And then when you think about where process meets technology with regards to that simplification, is thinking about those highly repetitive and really routine tasks that can be automated. So looking at process automation tools, there's about 8 or 10 of them out there that are really great, but they can help you drive significant efficiencies. And the great news is it doesn't mean you have to spend any more money. Quite often, a lot of folks on this call are from very large organizations, and the chances are pretty high that somewhere in your company, process automation is already happening. I take a peek at your accounts payable, your accounts receivable. They're a great use case for automation. And then really all you'd be looking for is someone to do some programming around the automation within the ATS. And we have a large global retailer who has done that end to end, but where they found that it offered them the most significant improvements in the process was this offer and start date changes. They spent significant time with start date changes. Automation allowed them to take care of it instantly and not only fix it in the system, but able to navigate all of those downstream impacts that happen when a new person starts. So they did not make the decision to reduce cost, but what they did is said, we really want to be able to focus on that critical period of onboarding. And so they were able to repurpose from a fairly mundane task of data entry to fix a start date and the subsequent flow to saying, let's give some white glove service. So it's an example where it wasn't a reduction in cost, it was maintenance, but they switched to a higher value proposition there. And then I think, we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit, Stu, about the role of AI. I think that there's a lot of legislation right now that makes AI a bit of a hot potato, but it has tremendous value to help human beings make smarter decisions. And so I want to make sure everybody heard that loud and clear. We're not proposing that AI becomes a decision maker, but that you consider those places where it truly is helping the human being make better decisions. And again, with the word faster on there. So I think that combination of both automation and AI are real big plays where organizations can have. And then the last thing I'd say with regards to these two categories is really dig into your existing tech stack. Ensure you're using all of the functionality that you've paid for with the tools that you have, and look for duplication. The TA tech marketplace is changing rapidly. And so what we have found, so at AMS, we'll go in and do a health check with our clients around their tech stack. And we'll often see that, they haven't really kept up with the new releases or the product roadmap for things that they bought in the past. And they may have bought things for sort of single use case. And so they've ended up with a pretty complex stack. And as those products evolved over time, they find, wow, I now have multiple tools that all do similar functionality. So a real specific example that we found in healthcare was the organization had two tools, which they had bought for different use cases, but over time, both of those tools had introduced interview scheduling functionality, and the client didn't realize it and had gone to market and bought a third tool. And by doing that health check, AMS is able to really highlight where have those inefficiencies been caused there, because that's almost an instant cost reduction. So when we say technology, it doesn't always mean spend more. Sometimes it means really dig in and look at what you have and optimize and potentially get rid of some things from there.
But I think that's the big piece as well, the rationalization piece, the kind of everyone wants to move towards doing more with less of a technology stack. So I think utopia for most organizations is to have a single provider that does 90% of what you need, and you can plug and play some of the others. The other thing I'll say on technology, we spend an awful lot of time with clients and with partner organizations thinking about why does the technology stack not work? Why is it not fit for purpose? And actually, a lot of it comes down to the initial purchase. And I think, Nicole, you mentioned this as well, just the idea that it's complicated out there. So as a TA leader, you're expected to be an expert on TA and process and workflow and all of that good stuff, which is kind of your kind of normal world. But you're also increasingly expected to be somewhat of a technical expert and really understand some of the technology that's coming at us thick and fast. And just sometimes I think going out to market and having a specific use case can be a terrific way to save some money in the short term. We've definitely seen a lot of organizations who are quite have healthy budgets around their TA technology, and so go to market almost looking just to buy ammunition, buy things that are out there to have the latest technology, and not necessarily thinking about how that then applies back into some of the nuts and bolts of their workflow, their ways of working, the things that they're really trying to achieve. So I think when you're thinking about tech stack and ecosystem, what's fit for purpose and actually getting something that's applicable to your use case, not necessarily the sexiest topic sometimes, but actually really important in terms of protecting that spend.
Yeah, and I think for our participants on the call today, I mentioned I came from industry, and AMS has a tool that's called AMS Verified, and it is a community where people are able to really come in, look at the TA tech marketplace. There's case studies, vendors are there, but the best thing is that other users are there, folks in industry, and you're able to do some things within that tool complementary that allow you to really be plugging around, connecting within a like community, because Stu, as you pointed out, it's a crazy world out there for TA tech, and TA leaders are expected to know, like, to the minute what's happening and what's out there. So I'd recommend, if folks haven't taken a peek at AMS Verified, I think back to when I was in industry and think, oh, I wish I had that when I was a kid.
Okay, and I conscious of the time as well, we want to make sure we leave some time for questions, etc. as well. But there's probably maybe 2 or 3 others on here that I think are worth stopping at for a little bit. And maybe I'll get started on this idea of always on attraction and what we call here differentiated skills engagement. And I think this is maybe an interesting one in that it's probably a prime example where market pressures, candidate expectations, general changes in the dynamics of the labour market have driven attraction and engagement strategies right to the top of a strategic priorities list for most TA leaders. It's quite rare we would go speak to TA leaders or industry leaders and they're not talking about how do we get in front of the candidates and say the right things when we get there. And that's how I was speaking to some colleagues on our side in our employer brand advisory team who were saying to me that actually 78% of companies in the world's most attractive employers survey last year, for example, had listed employer branding as a top strategic priority. So for those companies who are already doing it really well, this is right at the top of their agenda. And if anyone is familiar or has seen Josh Burson's last year, he put out some content around 15 essential TA practices. So what are the top things to really boost the way that you run TA as a function? 10 of those 15 practices that he and the team outlined as most important were either directly or tangentially related to brand attraction engagement. So this is a really significant part of what you should be thinking about as a TA leader. And for that reason, I think actually budgets generally have increased in this area. So spend is on the rise generally in this area for lots of TA organizations. But lots of the clients and customers we speak to don't actually see the ROI, the return on investment, keeping up with that. So the budget, the spend is increasing year over year, but the ability to drive the return on investment, they're not necessarily seeing that come through. And if you think you mentioned the tech landscape, I think this is the same in this space as well, Nicole. Just the range of vendors, the range of specialist tools, technology that are in play means that lots of us actually can't accurately calculate what the ROI is. We can only see one side of the equation, which is cost. And even then, this type of activity tends to be spread across TA, the business, HR, maybe a separate DEI function if it exists within the organization. And so you can't actually even see all of the half of the equation that you're supposed to be able to see. So at a really tactical level, we partner with lots of clients and customers simply to try and help them understand, what are you spending money on today? Is that actually working for what you need? And can we build you some reporting that helps you get at driving that ROI forward? So working with lots of organizations around what is their true spend? How do they get the return on investment they're looking for? Some of it's a data question. I think some of it's a kind of spending in the right place. But interestingly, we've also got lots of examples where you can probably reduce your overall spend in this area, but get much better bang for your buck on return on investment by just diverting that spend into the right places and potentially spending it slightly differently. So one example might be healthcare, pharmaceutical. AMS Advisory partnered with this organization and actually managed to reduce media spend overall by 50%, 50, but also managed at the same time to serve twice as many sponsored jobs to the core category of hiring that was most prominent in their hiring profile, and to maintain similar conversion rates across the channels that they were choosing to use. So by reducing some of the what you might call white noise, some of the things that makes you busy but not productive, and actually diverting the spend, the reduced spend into the more impactful areas, able to drive some really significant results in that sense. I think one other thing to mention on this idea of attraction, marketing, engagement is the switch away from what you might consider a more transactional media approach. So single job board for a single requisition, post the job, wait for the applications to come in, and process the applications. And the transition that's happening really quite quickly towards a more skills-led, always-on media approach, where you're always in the market speaking to the right people in a tailored and targeted way through dedicated TVP programs, so talent value proposition. And most customers that we work with, actually their EVP spend, their employee value proposition spend, has continued to increase, which is good, absolutely. But but it's meant that a lot of big organizations, the types of organizations that we've got on the call today, there's every organization is saying something similar at the corporate level, and so it's becoming difficult to really break through and differentiate yourself in specific talent segments. Technology may be one of the obvious ones, where technology skill set's not your core market for your sector. Being able to develop a targeted TVP that really speaks to technologists can make a huge difference. And as I said, our colleagues in employer brand advisory do a lot of really good work in that space. So I think key thing around media and attraction is overall media spend can be maintained, or an example I just gave actually can be reduced, but it's all about applying your spend more effectively, engaging talent early, often ideally above requisition, so that you can, I guess, aggregate your media spend in a slightly different way and point it to where it's most needed. That's one of the key pieces, I think, around managing your spend in that area. A couple of other things, Nicole, you already mentioned a little bit around hidden operating costs. So I think some of those things that you mentioned, for example, around just wastage, maybe in areas like administration, for example, the offer rework or the rework that happens around interview rescheduling, that's often hidden cost, because actually, speaking to an organization about this a couple of months ago, that's hidden because the ticket system only logs the ticket when the original interview request actually goes through. So when you get the 6 different rescheduled requests, that work is invisible to you. So you actually got your admin team in this instance working really quite hard to fulfill a task that you think has already been fulfilled because the ticket was only raised once. So there's some hidden operating costs in things like that. There's also what you might consider just shadow activity or hidden costs across the entire organizations. And what we mean by that is, when I say shadow TA function, it's essentially recruiting activity or recruiting tasks that are happening elsewhere in the business that either TA aren't necessarily paying for, or maybe inadvertently paying for and not realizing that activity has happened. And actually, there's been a number of occasions over the last 12, 18 months where we have sat down with an organization to work out their baseline, right? One of the first things Nicole and I will do is work out what is your cost baseline, where are the obvious areas for you to look at your reductions in one area, maybe to fund investment elsewhere, or maybe it's a net reduction in spend. But one of the first things we do is try to work out what are you spending as a TA organization. And in most instances, I'm tempted to say all, there is some degree of this shadow TA function that exists, or cost that you don't necessarily see. And the reason that's important is, one, you want to know what your actual true spend is. That's incredibly important. But cynically speaking, for us as TA leaders, it's also a potential pot of money that is currently unaccounted for in a TA leader's budget, but is being incurred by the business. And we find it a really quite powerful mechanism to be able to build a business case or leverage a business case around the idea that actually my TA function, my TA budget is not X, it's actually Y. But don't worry, I've got a plan to reduce it overall and be able to use some of that hidden budget and be able to build business cases around it. I think that's been a key piece when we think about building business cases. And yes, not very scientific, Nicole, but it's that idea of finding some money down the back of the sofa, right? That helps then you can take that forward and do something with it. The last piece I'll mention, and then I'm really keen to get on to, we've got a poll, but we also want to get on to some of the questions as well, is just this piece around agency reliance. So first thing I think to say, to be really clear, is that agency partners are an important part of your ecosystem when they're used strategically. No successful TA model entirely eradicates agency usage or should look to do so. Most TA functions, most optimized TA functions, partner with search firms for maybe between 6 to 8, 7 to 9% of total hires, leveraging a really select group of well-governed specific partners for specific needs. So I think the first thing to say is that no TA function is trying to race towards 0% agency usage. They provide a really important part of the ecosystem. But obviously, when the agency's not under control, it can add a hugely significant amount to your overall TA budget or overall business spend. And that can range, depends on geography, sector, types of hiring that you're doing, but for most organizations, that can be anywhere between $5 to $10 million a year. But I've also seen it, double, almost triple that number in some organizations as well, where average agency fee, for example, is maybe particularly high. So really significant chunk of anyone's TA budget, maybe as much as 20% of your entire TA budget may be sitting in this highly discretionary element of spend. And so when we work with organizations, a lot of what Nicole and I are trying to do is there an opportunity to take some of that spend and repurpose that elsewhere? So either reduce it significantly or take the gains from there and repurpose it into other organizations. And I think that, again, plays back into some of those questions around, for example, RPO. So AMS, thousands of sourcers working at AMS. We've got some real capability in that space. We've been able to partner with organizations to drive agency from 15% down to 6-7%, really significant savings that go with it. You've got hybrid models. But we've also worked with organizations in the last 12 months to build internal sourcing functions as well, being able to build in-house capability to drive some of those savings in-house too. So I think there's not a one-size-fits-all on that, but the idea of attacking direct sourcing through whichever means is best for you to drive down your agency, really smart place, I think, to start for driving some of those costs down. And then there's some other things, I guess, that are less kind of innovative but simple things like governance, PSL management, all that good stuff as well, I think is really important for managing some of that.
Yeah. So I think, Stu, it'd be great if we launch a poll right now, because I think for the audience, hopefully you found a couple of, oh, I haven't tried that, or I haven't thought about that. But I also find that there's things that stop us from even trying to do some of the quick wins that we've identified. So we'd like to hear from the audience. You're going to see a poll pop up in a moment about the challenges that you're having in actually trying to get some of these. And as that poll is loading, Stu, it reminds me just of your conversation about agency spend. And back when I was in industry, I worked for an engineering firm, and I went in and I honestly was embarrassed at their agency usage because it was at about 40-some-odd%. Very much so we'll call you, Nicole, and work with your team, but then we'll call our agency, because there was a legacy of behavior that had happened that managers felt that they owned, that they had personal relationships. And as I looked at that, that was really a blocker for me. So if I kind of look at this list of choices that folks have there, I almost didn't know where to start, because it was a company that had been in existence for 100 years. And I was the new hire coming in. And I wasn't even sure how to get my arms around it from there. So that was, I think, one of my big blockers that tied right into your comment there about the agency spend.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably a couple that stick out to me. One in particular is maybe the lack of internal investment. So I guess that could be financial, or it could be, I guess, just kind of strategic support and having an internal sponsor to help drive some of it. But one of the things when I used to lead sourcing teams and insights teams, one of the things that we used to do quite a lot was to use insights as our mechanism for kind of dislodging the value that the agency partners were bringing to specific hiring managers. If we were seen as so we as in the insights function, if we were seen as the way to bring that value, to share market knowledge, to share intelligence, then actually downstream we would also be able to execute on some of those roles as well. But one of the challenges I saw was actually that took a little bit of investment. We need a little bit of investment to build an insights team and some intelligence that we could then take to hiring managers, which would ultimately drive some pretty significant agency savings. But trying to build that business case internally around, just give me some cash over here so that I can take out some cash over there, we found that really quite difficult, and we had to chip away at that for quite a long time, and try to kind of build a business case, an internal story that helped us do that. So that's maybe the obvious one for me.
Yeah, and I see in the poll results, it looks like those top three are pretty well distributed in their responses as they're coming in. They seem to be jockeying each other for first place. And we'll talk a little bit about just the relevant skills and resources, I think is another one of really tech has changed the skills that are needed. There's a fierce competition for recruiters. I think it was probably, certainly post-COVID that the recruiter job title is actually the most sought after job title on LinkedIn, even above the coveted software development ones. And as organizations look at that, I think many of the activities we've talked about throughout help look at what are the right resources, what is the role that technology plays on that team, and also really being able then to look at how do we upskill our team and make sure that given the changes in technology that have been made available to them, they have the skills they need to deliver in a new way and truly drive the value. Because I know when I was a recruiter, I had no choice but to do administrative tasks. But now that we have solved much of that, we need to ensure that recruiters have the skills that they need then to deliver on the value add activities as well.
Increasingly often as well, this subject I'm really passionate about. So one of the other things I do alongside this kind of traditional consulting space is I also run what we call our Talent Lab proposition, which for me is all about how do we upskill existing in-house teams. We've also got Talent Lab proposition to help with some recruit, train, deploy mechanisms around things like tech upskilling, for example. But if you think about this in the specific context of this poll around lack of relevant skills within a TA function, we actually spend most of our time when we're building curriculums in partnership with clients thinking about what are the hard skills that you need to just be good at your job to hit some of the metrics that you're trying to do. And we probably spend less time on that stuff than the second part, which is what are the soft skills that unlock your ability to excel. So you could be a terrific, if you think about sourcing, you can know everything there is to know about Boolean search, for example, as a technical skill or a hard skill. But if you can't have a really good conversation with a hiring manager to convince them why a candidate that you find is the candidate for this job, you might as well not have been a very good Boolean sourcer in the first place. So I think that piece around hard and soft skills. There's also one example which I love. We did a program specifically thinking about project management within TA. So we did a program with a global airline looking at how is a TA manager, so not someone who recruits day to day, but who runs recruiting, how can we give them the project management skills that we expect of them to be able to run large scale programs within our organization, when actually nobody's ever stopped to just help these people understand how to project plan, how to risk assess, how to understand user impact, etc. So I think thinking about relevant skills in the context of different roles, changing roles, it's really quite complex, but there's also an awful lot of really good work starting to happen in that space.
Stu, it looks like we have some questions that have come in. So maybe in the interest of time, we can spend a few minutes answering questions that have come. And I'm going to pose the first one to you. I think we maybe have answered some of it, but I'd be interested if you can sum it up for us. What have been the main causes and reasons that have allowed TA costs to increase in recent times?
Well, you're going to give me an easy one. So I think there's probably a few things, and some of this is really advantageous to TA, and some of it's caused us some headaches. One is that talent has, it's a cliche, but talent has never been more important to what organizations strategically are trying to do across the entire firm. And there's a real recognition, if you look at a lot of the polling, a lot of the research, there's a real recognition that people are the differentiator for different organizations, and nothing can happen without having the right people in your org. And it's become increasingly difficult to access those highly prized skills. And as a result, I think TA has just never been more important in the general business strategy TA strategy is now business strategy in a way that maybe a number of years ago, the two things felt slightly separated. So I think for that reason, because TA has become much more important at the business strategy level, there's been a little bit more funding put in into that side of the business, a recognition that we need to fund this function properly in order for us to be able to deliver. I think part of it as well is a response to just how difficult the market is, right? So if you are consistently struggling with finding data scientists, for example, and you simply have to find a different way to do it, there's some additional spend that's went into trying to solve for some of those market challenges. And I think the third part, you talked about technology already today, but there has been a proliferation of technology in the TA space, and the price point, as it's become more complex, more sophisticated, the price point has also become higher, and as a result, budgets have had to kind of catch up to match that as well. So I think it's probably those three things: market conditions, technology, and needing to invest in technology to stay at least on par with peers, and then just the alignment between people as the solution to wider business strategy.
We have another question that came in, and maybe I'll take the first stab at this one and then you can do the next one. But the question is, what is the current trend around companies being proactive with workforce planning, thinking of the link between better planning resulting in reduced cost? And I hear workforce planning and I think of this, right? Who owns it? Who's going to do it? Does the business own it? Do the business partners own it? Does TA own it? And so I think probably the trend, it looks like, Allison, is nobody's cracked that nut. But we have seen some progress, primarily in organizations, frankly, where TA said, look, nobody's owning it. We're actually the ones that gain the most benefit from having it, so we're taking it. And again, it doesn't have to be a terribly complex activity. TA leaders generally have everything they need to create a fairly simplified plan. But one of the things that I'll help clients with is, let's look at past year revenue, production, growth goals. What did you do in hiring then? What kind of waste did you have? What are your projections in the next, most companies can't project out 5 years, but let's say at least in the next year. And if you can, as a TA leader, start to get some of those basic business data points, plus all of the historical information you have about what was happening with recruiting while business was delivering at, you can get guardrails. So if you know, well, the economy's tight, it's expected we're going to contract on revenue. I know in a low revenue year, I did this kind of thing. I think that helps. Doesn't solve it totally, but it gives the TA leader a direction. And then I think the other thing with that plan is really looking at what's the waste in the system behaviorally. Are people allowed to just open recs that celebrate birthdays, and how real are those? And then coming up with some real practical plans to say, here's where hiring should be. This is the waste we have that's above that plan or outside of these guardrails. And I think you'll find that organizations that even get to that level have been able to control the waste in the system really quite well.
The only thing I'd add to that, Nicole, and Alison, I think that's a really great question. There is also something interesting that's happening in this. So everyone is talking about being skills-led, and I think I'd suggest that a lot of TI organizations are still trying to unpack exactly what that means, right? So I think there's a little bit of demystifying to happen around that. However, there is a really exciting opportunity around this idea of not necessarily demand planning any longer around the requisition, and starting to be able to plan around skills need. And if you plan around skills need and you adopt and you switch to this model of being more almost above requisition in how you source and engage talent, you're almost always on. It means that you're less dependent on specific requisition numbers driving that demand. So I guess to use maybe a tangible example, the difference between hiring 50 developers or data scientists and hiring 75 data scientists is much more material in your planning when you're planning a 50% increase in requisition volumes between 50 and 75. It's much less material if you're simply planning for dozens of data scientists. The way you approach the market would be identical, and because you're not approaching the market for specific requisitions, it also gives you as a TA leader or a practitioner the ability to move that work around depending where the requisition eventually sits or if it's eventually created. So I think there's still a lot to unpack there, and I think we're all still trying to work out exactly how to do that, but there is something really interesting happening in that space that I think helps with smoothing some of those demand plan challenges.
Thanks, Stu. We have another question, and because of time and we want to have some closing, I want to try to get 2 questions in. So on this one, we'll ask you to think of a quick win. So the question is, what are the quick wins to add value to keep this priority triangle?
So the really honest answer is that when we speak with organizations, they often don't know their own reality in as much detail as they might like. So I would probably start or suggest that organizations start with building that foundation. So like we said, Nicole, one of the first things we try to do when we partner with organizations is go in and look at what is your baseline, and then let's work out where the opportunity scope is from there. So I'd probably give a really important, but not necessarily the most innovative in the world, start with the data, understand what your reality is truly like, and then be able to plan forward from there.
Yeah, and I think we have another question that says, what is the most important KPI to track successful cost reduction? And while it may seem that the obvious kind of KPI is what's your cost per hire, or what is your total budget, but when I think about that, and Stu, what you've said, we find with a variety of our clients is that they actually don't have a baseline. They are unable to, not unlike I was when I was trying to get my arm around agency spend, they actually have a hard time quantifying exactly what is the TA spend holistically in the organization. So I think as I think about both, I don't know it's a quick win, honestly, to figure out what is the baseline, because there's some work in that. You called it, I think, a forensic dive into finding that money. But when I think about that first KPI is that I can tell you what my organization spends on TA holistically, I think that would be my most important starting KPI. Then you can start to look into, have I reduced it? Have I optimized it? So Stu talked a bit about, there's actually some increase in spend around talent value propositions and our go-to-market strategies, but have we reduced it in the administrative burden within? So your ability to tell that. And I think the other, and we saw this in one of the blockers, it was one of those top 3 that kept jockeying back and forth, is about my ability to get kind of the commitment to the investment and being able to tell my story. And, you know, I come from HR, so I guess I feel a little bit okay saying this, but we are not terrifically great at accounting and finance, which is why we're not in accounting and finance. And so this concept of building a financial business case that ties in with a broader case for change can be quite a daunting task. And Stu, I know both you and I have worked with many organizations on how to do that. First, the help that we provide to clients in finding the cost and the spend, and then helping them actually put together both the financial as well as what's our story, and going out and ensuring people that do appreciate that value. And I know that we just have a minute left, Stu, so I just want to close with the audience a little bit about next, because we do have another kind of a panel session that we'll be offering to dig a little bit more into this concept of the business case, telling your story, so that TA leaders feel comfortable going to the business, going up to CHROs, and making a really compelling case for the change that they need to drive in their organization. So I think there's going to be a closing question. If you would like to be invited to that, please respond. But I think then we'll maybe close out. Just thank everybody for your time today. Hopefully, again, you've taken away at least one or two things that you can go back and start to think about immediately in your organization that you maybe haven't put a view on. Stu, anything in closing?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. Right.
Hopefully really useful session. Probably the only last thing to say is that if there are any follow-up questions, by all means, feel free to drop either myself or Nicole a note, or anyone else that you know at AMS, and it will eventually find its way to us. More than happy to do some follow-up, so just keep us posted.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you sit. Thank you.
Thanks all.